Today's video looks at price ceilings. A price ceiling is a maximum price you're allowed to charge. Let's start with the market in equilibrium. Let's imagine the equilibrium price is $10. Then, for whatever reason, politicians impose a $15 price ceiling on this market. What's going to happen? Why don't you pause the video and think of the answer before going on. Okay, what will happen is absolutely nothing. The market wants to set a price of $10. It doesn't want to go above $15. A ceiling is a maximum price. You can't go above your ceiling, but you certainly can go below it. Politicians imposing a $15 price ceiling is different from them imposing a $15 mandatory price. When you impose a $15 price ceiling, you're saying you can't charge more than $15. But markets don't want to charge more than $10 in this example. So the $15 price ceiling is non-binding. It has no effect. Some price ceilings do have an effect. They are binding. For example, if in this same market politicians imposed a price ceiling of 7, now there would be a shortage. Think why there would be a shortage. At a price of 7, consumers will be like, yay, we like low prices. We want to buy more than before. Producers will say, boo, we don't like low prices. We're going to make less than before. So if at the equilibrium point A, quantity supplied equal quantity demanded, at this new $7 price, well, the quantity demanded is going to be above quantity supplied. We can determine what the shortage is going to be by seeing where the price ceiling intersects the demand and supply curve. It intersects the demand curve at 110 in this example, meaning quantity demanded is 110. It intersects the supply curve at 60, making that quantity supplied. There's a persistent shortage in this market. Now, I say persistent shortage because oftentimes in markets there'll be shortages even without the government getting involved. But Adam Smith's invisible hand will have a tendency to get rid of shortages. But when there's a price shortage, the magic of the marketplace can't operate, and it won't go away. This market will be forever in shortage. The big question with shortages is how are goods allocated? Normally, goods are allocated through the price mechanism, right? If the market price is $10, generally everyone who wants a good and willing to pay 10 gets one. So that's how the good's allocated. It's allocated to people willing to pay $10 for it. But when there's a shortage, more people want to buy the good than can get it. So how is it determined who gets the good? Well, there's not a generalized answer to this. It depends on the individual market. It depends on who has more influence, who knows whom. Let's take a specific example. Let's imagine we have a demand and supply curve for gas with a market price of $5. Let's say a war breaks out in a faraway country, and that reduces the supply of gas. If markets are allowed to operate, the market will move from A to B, and at B, we're at a higher price. Now, this higher price of gas, this actually does some good things, right? This country has a problem. They don't have as great a supply of gas as they did before. And it would be really nice if people didn't drive as much. One way to get people to drive less is by raising the price of gas. I mean, you can imagine if this was some kind of a cooperative utopia, and everyone, the great leader says, okay, everyone, we know you all like to drive, but we've got a big problem. There was this war in a faraway place. Now we don't have as much gas, so we're going to have some problems unless people cut back. So can you all be nice citizens and drive less? And if all the citizens were nice and cooperative, they'd say, yeah, sure, we'll cut back. Unfortunately, most people are kind of self-interested, or at least a lot of people are, and just, arguing, you should drive less, please drive less because there's these social-wide problems. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily listen to that. The market mechanism, though, doesn't rely on people being altruistic. The market mechanism would say, okay, we need you to drive less, so we're going to raise the price. Now, when the price of gas has gone up, it's in your self-interest to drive less. This is a great example of Adam Smith's invisible hand working, right? It's in the best interest of society for people to drive less because of this war that reduced the supply of gas. If you raise the price of gas, and markets will automatically do this, this provides an incentive for people to drive less, and they will drive less. But let's say politicians get into the act and they notice that the price of gas is going up, and they said, well, no, this is horrible, this is exploitation or evil or whatever, so we're going to impose a price ceiling of $5 right where things were before. What's going to happen? Well, there'll be a shortage of gas. And in this example, there'll be a shortage of 700 units of gas. Now, how is this gas going to be allocated? Well, one way it might be is, maybe people have to line up at the gas station, and the people willing to wait the longest in line, they'll be the ones getting the gas. Or maybe, there'll be exceptions. If you're friends of the governor, you'll get gas. Probably emergency services will get gas. People who, if you're dating someone who owns a gas station, you'll probably get gas. But, again, the market won't be allocating who gets gas. It'll be, you'll have to have the money, you'll have to have the $5, plus you'll have to have something else. And it's not clear that the people who have that other thing are going to be the ones most deserving of gas. Let's talk about another type of price ceiling, and that's rent control. A lot of cities have rent control. With rent control, landlords are not legally able to charge more than a certain amount per apartment. So now, of course, a lot of apartments are different, so rent control is actually very, very complicated. But I'm going to use a simple model. I'm going to assume you have a city, every single apartment is identical, and the market price for rents would be $1,000 a month. But politicians decide to impose an $800 a month rent control, meaning you're not allowed to charge more than $800 a month. What's going to happen? Well, more people are going to want to get apartments at $800 than $1,000. So quantity demanded will be higher than it was in equilibrium, but quantity supplied is going to be lower, and this is going to create a shortage of apartments. Now, you might be thinking, wait, how can there be a shortage of apartments? It's not like the buildings will disappear. Well, there are two answers to that. First is some of the buildings, might be converted. Maybe normally someone would have an extra room in their house and they'd rent that out as an apartment, but if they can't get $1,000 a month for it, they'll convert it into a study. Or someone will turn an apartment building into a video game complex. Of course, over the long run, what will happen is that fewer apartment buildings will get built. Now, we can break down what happens due to rent control. In this equilibrium in the equilibrium we had before, there were 50,000 apartments for sale. Now, only 34,000 apartments will be made available. That's all quantity supplied is going to be. So this means that 16,000 people lose their apartments. 34,000 people, however, will keep their apartments or at least get cheaper apartments than they would under rent control. So 34,000 people in this simple model benefit, 16,000 people lose their apartments. There's a shortage of 70,000 minus 34,000. That's 36,000. A lot of these people, though, are people who aren't really hurt because they're people who didn't want apartments at the old price and do at the new price, but can't get apartments at the new price. So the people from basically 50,000 to 70,000, they did not want an apartment at the market rate. They would at the lower price of $800 a month, but they can't get one. So when there's rent control in this very simplistic model, there are three groups of tenants. There's the first group that gets to keep their apartment at a lower rate. They're mostly happy. There's the second group that lose their apartments. They're mostly sad. And there's the third group that can't get apartments and want them, but they only want them because the price is lower than it was at the market rate. So they might have suffered a little bit because they might put some effort into looking for apartments, but mostly they're made neither better off nor worse off. Let's now talk about rent control and the elasticity of supply of apartments. And in the diagram before you, I do two possible supply curves for apartments, one relatively inelastic and one very elastic. And you should see that the shortage is much greater if the elasticity of supply of apartments is higher. This makes sense. When you impose rent control, right, the more responsive landlords are, the more elastic the supply of apartments, the greater the loss in quantity supplied. So if someone really likes rent control and they want to say, oh, it's not, the bad things aren't really that bad, they're probably going to implicitly say that the supply of apartments is very inelastic. They'll say, landlords, they're pretty much going to still rent the apartments anyways, so the quantity supplied at the new rent control price will be just about the same because of the great inelasticity of supply of apartments. People who hate rent control will say, oh, no, the supply of apartments is really very elastic. And that if you force landlords to charge lower prices, they're going to cut back on the number of units they're willing to rent. Now, remember we talked about how elasticity is always larger in the long run than the short run? Well, that's certainly going to apply to apartments. So you'd expect rent control to create more of a shortage in the long run than the short term, because in the long run, the elasticity of supply of apartments is going to be higher. Let me go beyond the simple supply and demand analysis to talk about some other problems with rent control. A big one is that under it, landlords have a greatly reduced incentive to maintain a building. Let's imagine that the market value of my apartment is $1,000, but I'm only allowed to charge $800 for it. Well, if I don't do a very good job maintaining my building, I don't lose as much. Let's say if a building was in great shape, I could get $1,000 for it under market conditions. If it was under crappy shape, I could get $900 for it. So normally, if there weren't rent control, I would have a big incentive to maintain my building, because if I don't maintain it, I'll get lower rents. But if all I'm allowed to charge is $800 of rent for my apartment, well, now I don't lose that much by having the apartment being in worse conditions. So this is why inevitably when cities adopt rent control, they also have to have a whole bunch of policies and regulations making landlords keep up their buildings. Rent control destroys or really damages Adam Smith's invisible hand pressure on landlords to maintain their apartment buildings. So usually when rent control is enacted, cities have to replace the invisible hand with the heavy hand of government regulation, and this regulation is costly. Sometimes you can get really, really perverse outcomes with rent control when landlords are able to raise rents if the tenant leaves. Now just imagine you're in the situation. You're the landlord, you own the building, and if the tenant leaves, you can jack up rents. Well, now you're actually better off if the tenant leaves. This is inverting Adam Smith's invisible hand. You're going to do anything you can to get rid of the tenant. There's going to be regulations kind of restricting what you do, but certainly if there's a way of legally greatly annoying the tenant, you're going to do it. So rent control combined with being able to raise rents when new tenants come in, invert Adam Smith's invisible hand and give landlords a deliberate mechanism, a deliberate incentive to want to anger their tenants. Another problem with rent control is it's going to create a black market. So again, imagine I have an apartment for $1,000. It's worth $1,000, but I can only sell it legally for $800. There's lots of people who'd like to get this apartment because there's a shortage of apartments. Well, I've got an incentive to accept under the table payments, right? They rent to me, they officially pay me $800 a year or $800 a month, sorry, but they give me $100 extra in a black market payment. So I have an incentive as a landlord to accept bribes. Now this, will be illegal. This is a violation of rent control, but still both the potential tenant and the landlord have an incentive to go along with this. Because if I want to get an apartment and I'm willing to pay $1,000 a month and I can't get one because there's a shortage and there's a landlord, and I say to the landlord, look, I'd love for you to lend me, to give me an apartment for $1,000 a month, for $800 a month, but if you're not doing it, how about $900? So I'll give you this black market payment. So this, of course, creates incentives for cities to have to regulate this, and cities have to put effort into trying to find situations where tenants are paying more rent than they're legally supposed to, which is weird. Normally, you don't have to worry about people paying more money than they're legally supposed to and, being in on it, but rent control can really mess up incentives. And the third problem I want to talk about with rent control is racism. Very frequently, markets pit greed against racism. So let's imagine that we have a landlord who is racist and greedy, and there's no rent control. So, the landlord doesn't like people of a particular race, but there's a cost to the landlord of not renting to people of that race, because then, he might have to not get as good a rents. Or if someone from the race he doesn't like is willing to pay a little bit more and he says no, he's turning down money, he's hurting his greed. So an advantage of capitalism, of market economies, is that, to the extent you're greedy, race will usually not matter. But now suddenly with rent control, well, if there's a shortage of apartments and a huge number, there's a line of people who would love to rent your apartment building, if you're a little bit racist, it doesn't cost you anything to indulge in your racism because you can't, accept the amount that the apartment's worth anyway. So of course, this would be illegal in the United States, but it's very hard to regulate. If you've got 20 people who all want to rent your newly vacant apartment, how is anyone going to know if the reason that you picked one tenant over another was because of race?